The sergeant who broke every rule to save his brothers the metal was so cold it burned through his gloves. Technical Sergeant James Robert Caldwell pressed his eye against the gunner's scope, watching 3 German Panther tanks emerge from the tree line like wolves circling wounded prey. His breath came in short bursts, fogging the frozen air inside the cramped fighting compartment of his M10 tank destroyer. December 26, 1944, the frozen hills outside Bastogne, Belgium. Behind him, Private Danny Morrison waited with a shell cradled in his arms, a shell that wasn't supposed to exist. A shell that Caldwell had manufactured in secret for 3 weeks, in direct violation of every ordnance regulation the United States Army had ever written. The radio crackled. Battalion command was screaming orders to hold fire and withdraw. Enemy armor to heavy engagement would be suicide. Standard protocol when facing Panthers, those mechanical demons that had been slaughtering American tank crews since Normandy. But Caldwell had already seen the burning American trucks on the road below. He'd heard the screams of wounded men trapped in the snow, dying while he sat safely behind cover following orders that made perfect sense to officers 50 miles behind the front lines. His finger moved toward the trigger. In that frozen moment, Caldwell understood with absolute clarity that obeying orders meant watching good soldiers die. Disobeying could end his career, earn him a court-martial, maybe even a firing squad if the shell malfunctioned and killed his own crew. Or it could prove that German Panthers weren't invincible after all. What headquarters didn't know what they couldn't know was that the shell Morrison held wasn't standard issue. It was something Caldwell had been manufacturing in a salvaged lathe during the dark hours after midnight, using tool steel he'd traded cigarettes and whiskey to obtain, following calculations he'd worked out in the margins of his field manual. Something that would either save hundreds of lives or end his. The choice was his alone, the farm boy nobody expected. James Robert Caldwell grew up in rural Oklahoma during the Depression, when dust storms turned the sky black at noon and people learned to make miracles from nothing. He was the second son of a wheat farmer who lost everything when the land itself seemed to turn against those who worked it. His childhood wasn't defined by hardship. Hardship was simply the air everyone breathed. It was defined by solutions. Fixing tractors with baling wire when replacement parts didn't exist. Stretching food through winters that seemed endless. Making irrigation systems work with whatever materials could be scavenged or borrowed. His father taught him something the recruiter in Tulsa would never understand, that rules were written by men who'd never gone hungry, and survival meant trusting your hands more than someone else's words. That knowledge, earned through 1,000 small acts of improvisation, would one day mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of men Caldwell had never met. When he enlisted in April 1942, he wasn't running toward glory or adventure. Those were luxuries for men who had other options. Caldwell was 23 years old with calloused hands, a high school education that emphasized practical mathematics over poetry, and a younger sister who needed someone to send money home. The recruiter looked at his application and saw cannon fodder. Caldwell saw 3 meals a day and a paycheck. Neither of them imagined that this quiet farm boy would one day force the United States Army to rewrite its ammunition protocols. Basic training at Fort Knox revealed something unexpected. While other recruits struggled with ballistics calculations, the complex mathematics of trajectory, velocity, and armor penetration, Caldwell could work them out in his head. It was a skill born from years of calculating seed dispersal patterns, water flow rates, and the precise angles needed to make ancient equipment function. His instructors noticed, but didn't particularly care. The Army wanted men who could follow firing solutions, not question them. Initiative was fine in officers. In enlisted men, it was a liability. Caldwell was assigned to the tank destroyer force and trained on the M10 Wolverine, thinly armored tracked vehicle mounting a 3-inch gun designed for ambushing German armor. The doctrine was simple: use speed and maneuverability to hit enemy tanks from the flanks or rear where armor was thinnest. It was elegant doctrine. His crewmates in Charlie Company, 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, called him Oki with the casual cruelty of young men far from home. They saw a quiet farm boy who read technical manuals during poker games and sketched modifications to ammunition in the margins of his field notebook. Nobody took him seriously until France changed everything: the education of fire. The 776th arrived in Normandy in July 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, when the Bocage country had transformed into a meat grinder of hidden German positions and narrow killing lanes. The hedgerows that looked so pastoral from the air became death traps on the ground, ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that channeled American advances into predictable paths where German guns waited. Caldwell's first combat engagement lasted exactly 11 seconds. A German Panzer emerged from behind a hedgerow at 80 yards. His commander screamed to fire. Caldwell's hands moved on pure training, acquiring the target, calculating the lead, squeezing the trigger. The standard M79 armor-piercing shell struck the Panzer's frontal armor and bounced off like a stone skipping across water. It left only a bright scar on the German steel, a mark that might as well have been a signature stating American gunner, inadequate ammunition, please kill at your leisure. The Panzer's return shot missed by inches, not because the German gunner was incompetent, but because a P-47 Thunderbolt appeared overhead at that exact moment, and the Panzer commander chose survival over revenge. That night, shaking in his foxhole, while artillery rumbled in the distance, Caldwell began to understand the terrible mathematics of tank warfare. The M10's 3-inch gun was adequate against older German armor Panzer Es and early Panzer IVs with vertical armor plates. But intelligence reports spoke of newer models with sloped armor that deflected shells at angles that seemed to violate basic physics. And there were whispers of something worse. A new German tank called the Panther, with frontal armor so thick and so cleverly angled that American shells simply bounced off at any range, from any angle that mattered. Standard doctrine said tank destroyers should use speed and ambush tactics, hitting enemy armor from the flanks or rear, but Caldwell had seen the Bocage country. There were no long sight lines, no room to maneuver. When you met German armor, it would be face-to-face at point-blank range in a narrow lane between ancient hedgerows. And the crew with the better shell would go home, the other crew would burn. He started collecting dud shells that had failed to penetrate or detonate. He examined failed penetrations, measuring the angle of deflection, studying how different shell designs performed against captured German armor plates that engineering units brought back for analysis. His commander, Lieutenant Howard Brennan, a Virginia tobacco farmer's son who believed in doctrine the way some men believed in scripture, told him to stop wasting time and focus on the job. Caldwell nodded respectfully and continued his research in secret. Because the job, as he understood it, was staying alive long enough to kill Germans. And that meant understanding why American ammunition kept failing. The mechanical demon by autumn 1944, the Panther had evolved from rumor to nightmare. Every tank crew had stories. Every after-action report included variations on the same theme: Panther engaged at X range, American shells deflected, American vehicles destroyed, survivors scarce. The Panther wasn't just a tank, it was a philosophical statement about industrial warfare, a declaration that Germany could still produce weapons that made American numerical superiority irrelevant. Introduced in 1943 after German forces faced Soviet T-34s at Kursk and realized their existing tanks were obsolete, the Panther mounted a 75mm gun that could penetrate American Sherman tanks from 1,500 yards. Its own sloped frontal armor, inspired by the T-34's revolutionary design, deflected American shells even at close range. Intelligence estimates suggested Germany had produced over 6,000 Panthers by late 1944. They appeared everywhere: Italian mountains, French plains, Dutch polders. Mechanical killers that turned American armor advantages into funeral pyres. The standard American response involved massive numerical superiority. 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, accepting horrific losses to achieve victory through attrition. Tank crews developed dark humor about it. They called it the Ronson effect, after the cigarette lighter that advertised light's first time. every time. American tanks burned first time, every time. The Sherman's gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it particularly vulnerable. A Panther could sit hull down behind a ridge and destroy an entire American column before taking a single hit. German crews learned to target the Sherman's weak points with practiced efficiency. The ammunition stored in sponsons beside the driver, the fuel tanks in the rear, the thin armor protecting the turret ring. Every engagement became a math problem with bodies as variables. How many American tanks would burn before one lucky shot penetrated the Panther's thinner side armor? How many crews would die screaming as fire consumed their vehicles? The United States Army knew this was a problem. These experimental shells could penetrate Panther armor with shocking efficiency. But tungsten was desperately scarce, needed for machine tools and aircraft engines that kept the war effort functioning. Production was limited to a few thousand rounds per month, distributed primarily to elite units with political connections. Armored divisions commanded by generals who knew which congressmen to call. Tank destroyer battalions attached to famous infantry divisions. The 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to no one famous and commanded by no one politically connected, received exactly 0 HVAP rounds through official channels. They were expected to fight Panthers with the same shells that bounced off Panzer IVs. The frustration built through September and October as Caldwell's unit pushed toward the German border. Each funeral service, hasty affairs conducted in muddy fields, while artillery rumbled deep in Caldwell's conviction that men were dying because regulations valued tungsten for factory machinery over soldiers' lives. He began writing letters to ordnance depots, requesting technical specifications for HVAP manufacture. Most went unanswered. Military bureaucracy had no mechanism for responding to a sergeant's technical inquiries about classified ammunition. But one sympathetic supply officer, a forward depot man who apparently lost friends to Panthers and understood what Caldwell was attempting, sent him a single cutaway training round used for demonstrating internal construction to gunnery students. The package arrived with a note, "This is all I can spare. Make it count." Caldwell studied that training round like a medical student examining a cadaver, learning its secrets through careful dissection. The impossible solution, the HVAP design, was elegantly simple, which made its scarcity even more infuriating. The tungsten core, being denser than steel, maintained velocity better over distance and concentrated force on a smaller impact area. Pure physics, dense material moving fast beats thick armor. The challenge was manufacturing. Tungsten carbide required industrial equipment, precision machining, and materials that simply didn't exist in forward areas. The Army's solution was centralized production in secure facilities back in the United States, which created a supply chain measured in months rather than days. Men died while paperwork traveled. But Caldwell noticed something the designers perhaps hadn't considered, or had considered and dismissed as impractical. The penetrator didn't need to be pure tungsten carbide. It just needed to be harder and denser than the steel shell casing it replaced. And while tungsten carbide was rare, tool steel wasn't. Every machine shop in every rear echelon motor pool had tool steel used for cutting bits, lathe tools, equipment that needed to resist wear. It wasn't as hard as tungsten carbide. Physics was physics. But it was significantly harder than the mild steel used in standard shells. If he could manufacture a penetrator from tool steel and fit it into a standard shell casing, he might create something between a standard AP round and a true HVAP round. Not perfect, not what the engineers in their clean laboratories would design. The technical challenges were substantial enough to discourage anyone who valued their career over results. He needed to machine cylindrical penetrators to precise dimensions, remove the standard penetrator from existing shells without destroying the explosive burster charge, insert the modified penetrator, and ensure the shell would still fire without exploding in the barrel and killing everyone nearby. He had no lathe, no mill, no formal authorization, and no training in ammunition modification beyond what he taught himself from technical manuals and careful observation. What he had was Private Danny Morrison. Morrison was a Detroit auto mechanic who'd been drafted in 1943 and assigned to the tank destroyer force because the army needed men who understood engines. He could disassemble and rebuild a transmission blindfolded, could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, and possessed the kind of hands-on intelligence that formal education couldn't teach. More importantly, Morrison understood the same truth Caldwell did, that regulations written by men in safe offices meant nothing when your friends were burning alive in disabled tanks. They started in early November, working in a maintenance depot outside Metz where sympathetic motor pool sergeants looked the other way when men borrowed equipment after hours. The sergeants had lost friends too. They understood what Caldwell was attempting even if they couldn't officially acknowledge it. Morrison located a damaged lathe in his salvage pile equipment the motor pool had written off as too worn for precision work. They repaired it with parts cannibalized from two other wrecked machines, working through cold nights while their breath fogged the air and their fingers went numb. Caldwell drew detailed specifications based on the training round, calculating dimensions that would maintain the shell's balance while maximizing penetrator mass. Every measurement mattered. Too heavy and the shell would tumble in flight. Too light and penetration would be inadequate. The margin for error was measured in thousandths of an inch. They needed tool steel blanks. Morrison found them through the informal economy that existed in every military organization trading cigarettes and whiskey to a maintenance sergeant whose machinists used tool steel cutting bits. Each transaction was technically illegal, each blank represented contraband, and nobody cared because everyone understood the stakes. Each penetrator took 6 hours to machine on their rebuilt lathe. They worked in 2-hour shifts after duty hours, while Morrison stood watch for officers who might ask inconvenient questions. The work was exhausting and dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. One penetrator shattered during machining, sending steel fragments into the wooden wall behind the lathe with enough force to have killed anyone standing there. Another spun off-center and nearly broke Caldwell's wrist when the lathe bucked. But gradually, through trial and error and the kind of stubborn persistence that characterized men who'd survived the Depression, they developed a process. By late November, they had produced 32 modified shells, each one carefully marked with a small scratch on the base to distinguish it from standard ammunition. Testing was impossible. Firing unauthorized ammunition without approval could result in court-martial. Caldwell couldn't exactly request a Panther for target practice. "Excuse me, sir, could you arrange for a German tank so I can test my illegal ammunition?" Instead, he relied on mathematical models and desperate hope. His calculations suggested the tool steel penetrator should increase penetration by perhaps 15 to 20% over standard shells. Whether that would be enough to defeat Panther armor depended on range, angle, and the kind of luck that couldn't be calculated. They loaded the modified shells into their tank destroyer's ready rack, placing them in specific positions where Caldwell could identify them by touch in the chaos of combat. Muscle memory would matter when there was no time to think. Lieutenant Brennan noticed the scratched markings during a routine inspection. His eyes narrowed. "What's this, Sergeant?" Caldwell had prepared his answer. "Personal identification system, sir. Tracking ammunition expenditure for after-action reports." It was technically true, just profoundly incomplete. Brennan, who had learned over months of combat to trust his gunner's competence, if not always his methods, accepted the explanation without pressing further. The rest of Charlie Company remained unaware that their battalion's most reliable crew was carrying homemade ammunition that violated at least a dozen ordnance regulations. They stored the shells and waited. November passed into early December. The battalion moved into reserve positions in Luxembourger Quiet Sector where the brass expected nothing to happen. The men played cards, wrote letters home, and dreamed of Paris leave. Caldwell used the time to produce 18 more modified shells, pushing their inventory to an even 50. Morrison joked that if they survived the war, Caldwell could start an ammunition company. Caldwell's custom shells "We penetrate what the army can't." Caldwell didn't laugh. He could feel something building in the cold December air. a tension that reminded him of Oklahoma thunderstorms gathering on the western horizon. Weather that looked peaceful until it killed you. The German army launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. 3 German armies, including elite panzer divisions with hundreds of Panther and Tiger tanks, smashed through thinly held American positions in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion received emergency orders to move north and reinforce the collapsing front. They drove through freezing rain and snow, past columns of American troops retreating in disorder, past burning vehicles and abandoned equipment that told stories nobody wanted to hear. The radio traffic was chaotic, panicked reports of German armor breaking through everywhere, entire American units surrounded and cut off, defensive lines that existed on maps but not in reality. By December 20th, Caldwell's company had reached the outskirts of Bastogne, a crossroads town that the Germans desperately needed to capture. The American 101st Airborne Division held Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, fighting off constant attacks with dwindling ammunition and no clear hope of relief. The 776th's mission was to keep the roads open for supply convoys trying to reach the besieged paratroopers. It was a mission that guaranteed contact with German armor. Panthers were everywhere in the Ardennes, leading assault spearheads, crushing American resistance with mechanical efficiency. The first engagement came on December 22nd. Caldwell's crew, positioned in a tree line covering a crossroads, spotted 2 Panthers moving along a ridgeline 800 yards away. The range was too long for a reliable shot with standard ammunition, suicidal at that distance against frontal armor. Lieutenant Brennan ordered them to hold fire and wait for the Germans to close, standard doctrine, sensible tactics. But the Panthers stopped at the ridge and began firing at American positions in the valley below. High explosive shells destroying supply trucks, killing men who survived Normandy and Holland only to die in Belgian snow because tank destroyer crews were following doctrine. Caldwell watched through his scope as 2 trucks erupted in flames. Heard screaming over the radio, wounded men trapped, burning alive while help sat 800 yards away following orders not to engage. The Panthers weren't closing. They were using their range advantage exactly as German doctrine prescribed, sitting in superior positions, destroying American forces with impunity. Caldwell made a decision. He loaded one of his modified shells without announcing his intention, without requesting permission, without following any protocol that would have delayed action long enough to watch more men die. His hands moved with the muscle memory of hundreds of practice drills. Acquire target, calculate range, account for wind. Lead for movement, fire. The shell covered 800 yards in less than 2 seconds. It struck the lead Panther's turret ring at a slight angle and penetrated with a sound Caldwell would remember for the rest of his life. Not dramatic, not Hollywood explosive, just a hard metallic punch that meant physics had won. The Panther didn't explode. It simply stopped moving as smoke poured from the interior and the crew bailed out through the hatches, running from their invincible machine that had just proven painfully invincible. The second Panther reversed rapidly behind the ridge line and disappeared. German tankers weren't suicidal. When American guns started penetrating frontal armor at ranges that shouldn't be possible, retreat became the only rational choice. Lieutenant Brennan's voice came over the intercom, tight with controlled fury. "Caldwell, what ammunition did you just fire?" This was the moment, court-martial or vindication. Career-ending or war-winning, Caldwell told him the truth. Brennan stared at him for a long moment through the cramped fighting compartment. Then he said, "We'll discuss this later. If we survive, load more of those shells." They had just proved that homemade ammunition could kill Panthers at ranges where standard shells were useless. The implications were staggering and terrifying for anyone who understood military bureaucracy. Word spread through the battalion faster than official communications. Other crews heard that Caldwell's destroyer had knocked out a Panther at 800 yards, something nobody thought possible with an M10's 3-inch gun, Men started asking questions. Where did the ammunition come from? Could they get some? Was this the secret weapon that would finally even the odds? Caldwell found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously in violation of regulations and the most popular gunner in the battalion. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Randall, a West Point graduate who valued results over protocol, called Caldwell to his command post on December 23rd. Caldwell expected a court-martial. Instead, Randall asked him to explain the technical specifications of his modified shells. Every detail, nothing omitted, Caldwell laid out the mathematics, the metallurgy, the manufacturing process. He showed his calculations, explained the physics, demonstrated that he'd done actual research rather than just guessing. Randall listened without interruption. Then he asked a critical question. How many shells have you produced? 50, sir. Randall did the calculation silently. 50 shells divided among the battalion's 36 tank destroyers meant each crew could have one, maybe two special rounds for emergency use. Not enough to change the campaign, but enough to give individual crews a fighting chance against Panthers. Randall made a command decision that would have ended his career if it backfired. Sergeant Caldwell, you're going to teach this process to selected mechanics in each company. We're going to manufacture more shells, a lot more shells. It was completely unauthorized. A violation of ordnance protocols, chain of command. Probably several articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that Randall could list from memory, and absolutely necessary. Christmas in hell, December 24th, Christmas Eve, the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to fly support missions, but the ground situation remained desperate. German forces were pushing toward the Meuse River. Bastogne was still surrounded. The outcome remained uncertain. The 776th received orders to support a task force trying to break through to the besieged paratroopers. Intelligence reported at least a company of Panthers, approximately 14 tanks defending the approach routes. Caldwell's crew, now equipped with 73 modified shells after a frantic manufacturing session involving mechanics from 3 companies, moved into position covering the main road from the south. Against 14 Panthers, it was still a desperate gamble. But now it was a gamble with slightly better odds. The attack began at dawn on December 25th, Christmas morning. Within minutes, German Panthers emerged from concealed positions and began destroying American vehicles with methodical efficiency. Caldwell's destroyer, positioned on a slight rise overlooking the road, engaged targets at ranges between 400 and 900 yards. The modified shells performed beyond expectations, beyond hope, beyond anything anyone had dared believe. Where standard ammunition would have bounced harmlessly off Panther frontal armor, the tool steel penetrators punched through, creating catastrophic damage inside German tanks. Not every shot penetrated. Physics still had limits, but enough did to matter. Caldwell fired 17 rounds in 43 minutes. 11 confirmed penetrations on 7 different Panthers. 3 Panthers burned completely, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular explosions that sent flames to 100 feet into the winter sky. 4 others were disabled and abandoned by their crews. The loader's compartment filled with acrid smoke from the breach. Spent casings piled around their feet like brass snowdrifts. The radio filled with voices shouting fire missions, casualty reports, desperate calls for support. The breakthrough to Bastogne succeeded partly because Caldwell's destroyer eliminated the Panther strong point that should have stopped the relief column. Other tank destroyers in the battalion, now equipped with varying numbers of modified shells, contributed to the victory. By noon on December 25th, forward elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the 101st Airborne's positions. The siege was broken, but the battle was far from over. German forces continued attacking throughout late December and early January, trying to regain momentum, trying to salvage something from an offensive that had already cost them irreplaceable armor. Caldwell's crew fought in a dozen more engagements, using their modified ammunition to engage Panthers at ranges German crews thought were safe. The psychological impact was significant. German tankers accustomed to American shells bouncing off their armor suddenly found themselves vulnerable at extended ranges. Some German commanders began withdrawing their Panthers from forward positions, reducing their effectiveness as breakthrough weapons. Fear was contagious. When invincible machines stopped being invincible, tactics changed. By mid-January, when the Bulge was finally eliminated and American forces resumed their offensive into Germany, the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion had manufactured and expended over 400 modified shells. The confirmed kill count against Panthers and other heavy German armor was 73 vehicles destroyed or disabled. Compared to the typical 5-to-1 loss ratio, when American forces engaged Panthers with standard ammunition, it was revolutionary. It meant American crews went home instead of burning. It meant victories instead of retreats. It meant one sergeant's refusal to accept inadequate equipment had saved countless lives. The reckoning. The official investigation began in late January, when an ordnance inspector discovered the modified shells during a routine ammunition inventory check. The inspector, a by-the-book captain from a depot unit who had never heard hostile fire, never watched friends burn, never made decisions where wrong choices meant death, wanted immediate court-martial for everyone involved. He filed a report citing violations of ammunition safety protocols, unauthorized modification of ordnance, misappropriation of military materials, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The report went up the chain of command, where it encountered a different reality. Field commanders who had watched Caldwell's innovation save lives and win battles had zero interest in prosecuting the men responsible. Lieutenant Colonel Randall submitted a counter-report documenting the modified shell's effectiveness, including testimony from dozens of crewmen whose lives had been saved by improved ammunition. He pointed out that the Army's failure to provide adequate anti-Panther ammunition to frontline units had created the necessity for field-expedient solutions. The choice was simple: either punish the men who solved the problem, or fix the supply system that created it. The matter escalated to theater headquarters, where it landed on the desk of a general who understood that good publicity was hard to find in the winter of 1945. Prosecuting innovative soldiers for saving American lives would be a public relations disaster. The general made the problem disappear. No court-martial, no official reprimands. Just a quiet directive to ordnance departments instructing them to increase HVAP ammunition production and distribution to frontline units. Caldwell received a Bronze Star for valor in combat, with the citation carefully omitting any reference to homemade ammunition. The real recognition came from fellow soldiers who knew the truth. The long peace. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Caldwell returned to Oklahoma in November, discharged as a Master Sergeant with 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart from a shell fragment wound received during the final push into Germany. He married his high school sweetheart that Christmas, bought a small farm with his military savings, and never spoke publicly about the modified shells. Some stories didn't need telling. The men who mattered already knew. Danny Morrison went back to Detroit, opened an auto repair shop, and occasionally told customers about the war when they asked about the scar on his left forearm. He never mentioned Caldwell by name, respecting his friend's privacy, but the story lived on in fragments. Lieutenant Brennan returned to Virginia and his tobacco farm, maintaining correspondence with Caldwell for 40 years. They met once in 1963 at a 776th Battalion reunion in Washington. Brennan, by then a successful businessman, told Caldwell that disobeying orders to hold fire on December 26th had been the right decision. Caldwell responded that he had disobeyed. He interpreted the order to hold fire as guidance subject to tactical revision based on ground conditions. They both laughed at the distinction without difference, the kind of laughter that only comes from shared experience that can't be explained to those who aren't there. The technical legacy of Caldwell's improvisation appeared in unexpected places. In 1953, the Army's Ordnance Corps published a field manual on expedient ammunition modifications for use in future conflicts. The manual included a section on field manufactured penetrators using available tool steel, with specifications remarkably similar to Caldwell's original design. The manual didn't credit Caldwell by name, but veterans who read it recognized the source immediately. The broader lesson was taught at West Point and other military academies as a case study in tactical innovation. Officers learned that rigid adherence to doctrine in the face of battlefield reality was a recipe for defeat. They studied how a farm boy from Oklahoma with no formal engineering education had solved a problem that stumped ordnance experts by trusting practical experience over official specifications. The story became part of cultural knowledge passed down through generations of tank cruiser reminder that survival often depended on individual initiative rather than institutional support. Caldwell lived to be 87 years old, dying in 2003 in the same Oklahoma farmhouse where he was born. His obituary mentioned his military service, but focused mainly on his contributions to the farming community and his 57-year marriage. The detail about modified shells appeared in the second-to-last paragraph, a brief mention that he had developed improved ammunition during the Battle of the Bulge. But among veterans and their families, the story was told and retold. Morrison's grandson, researching his family history, discovered technical drawings in his grandfather's papers showing exact specifications for the modified penetrators. He donated the drawings to the National Archives, where they remain available to researchers studying American ammunition development. Several modified shells recovered from battlefield positions decades after the war are displayed in military museums as examples of field expedient engineering. The plaques beside the exhibits explain how one sergeant's refusal to accept inadequate equipment saved countless lives and changed American anti-armor tactics. The shells themselves are unremarkable standard 3-inch cases with small scratch marks on the base. But to anyone who understands their history, they represent something larger than metallurgy. They represent the moment when individual courage and practical intelligence overcame institutional failure. The mathematics of duty. The final irony is that Caldwell never considered himself a hero. In interviews conducted late in his life by military historians, he consistently deflected credit, insisting that Morrison deserved equal recognition for the manufacturing work. That Lieutenant Brennan had shown real courage in authorizing continued use of the shells, that the real heroes were the men who fought in the snow and died in burning tanks. He maintained that he had simply applied basic mechanical principles learned on an Oklahoma farm to a military problem. The shells worked because tool steel was harder than mild steel, a fact known to any machinist. The innovation wasn't in the science, but in the willingness to act without permission when permission would have arrived too late. When asked why he had risked court-martial to develop unauthorized ammunition, Caldwell gave an answer that summarized his entire philosophy. Men were dying because the people who wrote procurement regulations had never watched friends burn alive in disabled tanks. Rules are important, but they're not more important than the lives of the men fighting the war. Someone had to make that decision on December 26, 1944. I happened to be in the right position with the right skills to do something about it. If that makes me a hero, then being a hero is just another word for doing your job when nobody else could. What shattered the invincibility of German Panthers wasn't advanced technology developed in secret laboratories or brilliant tactical innovations from military academicians. It was scratched base shells manufactured on a salvage lathe by men who trusted their hands more than regulations. It was a sergeant from Oklahoma who understood that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a complex problem is basic physics applied with courage. It was the recognition that institutional competence couldn't replace individual initiative. That survival often depended on the willingness to break rules written by people who would never face the consequences. The mathematics of victory in the Ardennes were written not in official after-action reports, but in the scratch marks on homemade shells that turned German Panthers into burning metal coffins. 73 confirmed kills for 100 shells manufactured in violation of every ordnance protocol. Hundreds of American lives saved because one man decided that disobedience was the highest form of duty. That calculation, more than any strategic plan or industrial production figure, revealed the truth about how wars are actually won. Not by the armies we wish we had, but by the soldiers we're lucky enough to have when everything goes wrong. When the regulations say impossible and the battlefield demands results, victory belongs to those brave enough to trust their judgment over someone else's rules.